Ever look at the wealthy and wonder why they seem to exist in a totally different dimension? I'm talking about that invisible switch where the daily grind stops and your money finally starts doing the heavy lifting for you. There is a specific mathematical threshold where this gravity shift happens. And trust me, it is not the number you think it is. My name is Frank. I spent years dissecting the mechanics of wealth, analyzing exactly what shifts when people move from simply making a living to actually owning their time. I've tracked the real-world data behind these milestones, and what I found exposes a major flaw in the standard advice we're all fed. This insight won't just tweak your portfolio strategy. It is going to fundamentally rewrite how you view every single dollar you earn. Here's where almost everyone gets their wires crossed. When people hear wealth, they usually think of a high salary, or they obsess over net worth, which is often just a vanity metric tied up in your house or car. I used to fall for that trap too, but the only number that actually matters is your invested capital, the money that is actively deployed in the market. See, we're taught that wealth building is a straight line. You assume $200,000 is just twice as good as $100,000, that $1 million is just 10 times more of the same grind. It is not. Money does not behave linearly at scale. It moves in quantum leaps. There are specific tipping points where the old rules simply expire and a completely new game begins. At that threshold, you do not just have more money. You effectively become a different species of operator in the economic system. You stop relying on labor and start owning the capital that produces results. This is not a mindset shift. It is a hard mathematic change in how the economy interacts with your existence. This is where the math starts to explain why the shift feels so violent. Let us run the numbers. When someone has $10,000 invested earning a 7% annual return, that capital produces roughly $700 a year. It is helpful, maybe covers a few bills, but it does not change your reality. You still have to wake up and grind at $50,000 invested. That same return generates about $3,500 a year. That is a nice vacation or a safety buffer. But let us be honest, your job remains mandatory. You are still trading your life hours for survival. Then the numbers cross a different line. $1 million invested at that same 7% produces around $70,000 a year, and that income shows up without a single meeting, without overtime, without sitting in traffic, and without asking anyone for permission. 0 hours required. The money works whether you are breathing or not. What makes this specific number hit so hard is what it replaces. Recent data shows the average American household spends roughly $67,000 a year. So at that $1 million level, investment income is no longer just a bonus. It is now powerful enough to fund an entire existence on its own. Your capital stops just assisting your life and starts fully carrying the weight of it. I have watched people run this math for the first time and just go silent. They are not celebrating, they are recalibrating, because they realize this is the exact moment when capital begins outperforming labor. And once that happens, the relationship with money can never stay the same. When you are strictly a saver, your entire mindset is playing offense. You are laser focused on accumulation, pushing harder, and simply adding to the pile. Every decision gets filtered through a lens of raw growth and speed, but the moment you cross into true capital ownership, that posture flips upside down. The primacy. Suddenly, the game is no longer about getting rich. It is about staying rich. Savers are chasing momentum, but capital owners are protecting position. One group is desperate to get ahead, while the other is calculating how to never fall back. And that difference quietly reshapes every single financial choice you make. The math alone is enough to permanently alter how you process risk. Consider a standard 10% market correction. On $20,000, that drop costs you $2,000. It stings, but it is survivable. You can technically replace that loss with labor, but that same 10% drop on $1 million wipes out $100,000. That is 6 figures gone. Same percentage, but a completely different psychological impact. I have watched investors react to this exact same market move. When your capital is small, downturns feel like personal failures. But when capital is large, the perspective shifts, the loss is bigger, but the foundation underneath it is stronger. At that scale, volatility stops being a disaster you fear and starts becoming an inefficiency you can plan around or even exploit. This is where the theoretical math finally hits the pavement of your actual Monday morning. It is not necessarily about handing in your resignation letter tomorrow. It is about showing up to work from a completely different tactical position. When your investments can theoretically cover your basic burn rate, your job stops being a lifeline you cling to and starts becoming a contract you choose to renew. That shift sounds subtle, but it changes the leverage in every single room you enter. I have seen people walk away from toxic managers they used to tolerate simply because they needed the health insurance or the steady paycheck. They do not leave angrily, they just leave calmly. I have seen others sit at the negotiating table and demand what they are actually worth, knowing full well they are not trapped by the outcome. If the answer is no, they can walk. Some take roles that pay significantly less but offer better sanity, healthier hours, or work they actually give a damn about. Others finally launch that business they have been postponing for years because the downside no longer means financial collapse. It just means a temporary setback. What looks reckless to your broke colleagues is actually calculated. When you have a financial fortress, risk stops meaning survival versus failure. It becomes a simple trade-off. You can try something that does not work and return to where you were, while your capital keeps doing its job in the background. But the most profound change is not about income. It is about time when you are building toward that first major milestone. Every hour not spent earning feels expensive. But once capital is carrying the heavy load, time quietly becomes the scarcest asset you own. And that realization forces you to stop selling your days to the highest bidder and start hoarding them for yourself. Another shift happens quietly in the background, and most people never see it from the outside because they are simply not invited into the room. Access changes. Certain investments are not exclusive because they are complex or mysterious. They are inaccessible simply because they have a cover charge. When someone has $20,000 invested, a $50,000 or $100,000 minimum buy-in is not a strategy choice. It is a closed door. Entire categories of private equity, commercial real estate syndications, and pre-IPO deals simply do not exist for you. That changes instantly once capital reaches a different scale. With a $1 million base, allocating $50,000 to a private deal is just a 5% position. It no longer concentrates your risk, it actually diversifies it. Opportunities that were mathematically impossible become standard options. I have also watched how institutions respond once that foundation is visible on their screen. Banks stop treating you like a potential liability and start treating you like a client. They are terrified to lose. The conversations shift, terms improve, access to credit becomes easier, not because your character changed, but because your collateral did. What is critical here is that none of this feels dramatic while it is happening. The system simply unlocks doors that were never built for small balances. And once those doors swing open, the playing field stops feeling flat. Structure begins to matter more than effort, and your position starts to matter more than your intention. This is the part almost no one talks about honestly because it sounds ungrateful. The pressure does not disappear when you cross that threshold. It changes shape when an investor has $50,000. A 5% market drop means losing about $2,500. It is uncomfortable, but it is manageable. You can sleep through it. At $1 million, that same 5% swing is $50,000 gone, not on paper in real time. I have watched people experience this for the first time and struggle to articulate the vertigo. You can lose more money in a bad Tuesday afternoon than many people earn an entire year of labor. Daily portfolio movements start exceeding your monthly salary. The percentages are the same, but what really shifts is your awareness. Suddenly, volatility is not abstract. It shows up every time you unlock your phone. That is when behaviors start changing. People check balances more often than they admit, not because they plan to sell, but because they need to see where the ground is. I have seen calm, rational professionals become unusually sensitive to short-term noise, even when nothing about their long-term plan has changed. This is also where risk tolerance quietly resets. The aggressive mindset that helps someone accumulate capital is rarely the mindset that helps them keep it. A 20% drop on a smaller portfolio feels like a setback on a larger one. It feels like years of your life have been erased, and so strategies shift. Growth gives way to preservation. Stability starts to matter more than upside. What surprises most people is that this reaction is not emotional weakness. It is rational. When the stakes get high enough, protecting what you have built becomes more important than proving how smart you are. The irony is that the people who can most afford to take risks often become the most cautious where it matters most. Despite all that tension, something profound happens underneath the surface. Most people who cross this threshold do not feel fearless, they feel anchored. The uncertainty of the market does not disappear, but your baseline reality shifts. When your investments can theoretically support your lifestyle for years, risk simply loses its teeth. You're no longer constantly standing on the edge of a financial cliff, wondering if one wrong step will send you into free fall. That foundation creates what I call the optionality mindset. It is not freedom from consequences, it is freedom from desperation. Economic downturns feel less personal when you own assets that historically recover. Job security matters less when you know your mortgage is not dependent on your next 2 paychecks. Even unexpected medical costs stop feeling like a crisis and start looking like just another transaction. I have seen how this opens doors. People never allow themselves to consider choice that once felt reckless start to look reasonable. You might choose to live in a more expensive city because you actually enjoy the culture, or you might leave one to stretch your time instead of your income. You might start a business that could fail without the terror that failure equals financial ruin. You can take a steady job that is boring or a risky one that is meaningful. Knowing neither choice threatens your survival. This extends to family too. Supporting aging parents becomes feasible without panic. Taking 6 months off for a new child does not trigger anxiety about long-term damage. Even saying no becomes easier when no does not carry hidden financial penalties. What is striking is that none of this requires perfect certainty. It works precisely because the foundation is strong enough to absorb mistakes. Money does not remove the risk of living. It just changes how much room you have to respond to it. This is where the mathematical advantage of scale starts to look almost unreasonable. Let us look at the raw numbers. When $1 million grows by just 8% in a single year, that is $80,000 added to your net worth. That happens without you lifting a finger. For most people, that $80,000 is more than they could possibly save after years of disciplined sacrifice and budgeting. I have seen how long it takes someone to grind their way to that first milestone. It takes decades of consistency, restraint, and saying no to things you want. But once that base exists, the math changes the pace entirely. Growth begins stacking on top of itself in a way effort alone never could. The second million does not arrive because you suddenly became smarter. It arrives faster because the capital itself is now doing the heavy lifting. Time compresses, progress accelerates. At this specific level, tax optimization stops being a footnote and starts becoming a core business strategy. When your investment income grows large enough, the difference between paying 15% and ordinary income rates of 30% is not the erasing of dollars in your pocket each year. That is when planning becomes worth the complexity at its location and tax loss harvesting begin to matter because the scale makes the effort pay off. I have noticed that this is also where financial infrastructure quietly upgrows. Private banking relations make sense. Dedicated advisors stop being a luxury and start functioning like essential tools. Not because you became smarter overnight, but because your financial life is finally complex enough to benefit from specialization. What stands out most is how intentional everything becomes. The wealthy do not just have more money, they have better systems built to protect it, move it efficiently, and keep more of what it produces. At some point, the actual unit you use to measure value fundamentally changes. You stop thinking in individual dollars and start thinking in time, months, years, financial runway. When capital is generating around $70,000 a year, a $10,000 unexpected expense no longer feels catastrophic. You know almost instinctively that the system will replace that capital in a relatively short window. Not overnight, but without panic. I have watched how this shift alters behavior in subtle ways. People stop reacting emotionally to short-term costs because they understand what those costs represent in time, not just in cash. Money becomes less about immediate survival and more about continuity. There is room to absorb mistakes, room to pause, room to plan. This is also where thinking extends beyond personal security. When wealth grows faster than it is spent, the focus starts to move outward. Capital stops being just a tool to fund one life and starts feeling like something that needs to be managed responsibly. Stewardship replaces accumulation. Decisions are no longer about getting ahead as quickly as possible, but about protecting something that can last. That shift creates a kind of breathing room that is hard to describe until you feel it. Short-term setbacks lose their power. Unexpected expenses do not spiral into anxiety. The future stops feeling fragile, and once money is measured in time instead of stress, it quietly reshapes how people think about what comes next. This is where the system starts to feel like it has hidden levels that only unlock after you win the first round. Not because the rules change, but because your access does. When capital reaches a certain critical mass, leverage becomes cheaper, faster, and significantly more flexible. Credit stops being something you have to apply for and starts becoming something that is offered to you. Lines of credit margin and asset-backed borrowing begin to appear as strategic tools instead of dangerous risks. What is happening underneath is simple physics. Capital starts creating more capital before your effort even enters the picture. You are no longer waiting years to accumulate enough cash for the next move. You can act the moment opportunities show up. I have seen how dramatically this changes. The pace deals that would take months of preparation suddenly move in days. You do not have to sell assets to buy others. You do not have to miss opportunities because cash is tied up. The system quietly rewards those who already have a base. From the outside, it looks like momentum. From the inside, it feels like unfair access. One of the strangest shifts shows up in how risk is actually taken. The people who can most afford to lose money often become the most conservative with their core holdings. They protect the base at all costs. Then almost paradoxically, they become more aggressive at the edges. 80% stays stable and diversified. The remaining 20% absorbs experimentation, upside, and wild risk. From the outside, that looks cautious. In reality, it is controlled. What is harder to anticipate is the social effect. Money conversations start to feel incredibly awkward. You cannot easily complain about volatility when a bad day in the market moves. You cannot explain the stress of managing assets without sounding detached from everyday concerns. I've seen people go silent in rooms where they used to speak freely. This creates a subtle isolation. Your real financial worries do not disappear, but they stop being relationship problems. And so, without intending to, people pull back. This isn't about hitting a flashy number or proving anything to anyone. It is about crossing into a different financial reality where money stops dictating every move and starts working in the background. The real change is not what you earn. It is who you become in the system. Once you understand where that threshold sits, the path forward gets clearer. You stop guessing. You stop chasing noise. You finally have a map that shows what actually matters before and after the line.